Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With the president of Venezuela sitting in a U.S. jail, what does this say about the future of American engagement in the world? Let's get to the bottom line. The year started off with a bang, a big bang. The U.S. military invaded Venezuela and took its president, Nicolas Maduro, by force to a jail cell in New York City. Dozens of his protective Cuban guard were killed, and while he and his wife faced drug trafficking charges, President Donald Trump has now focused on Venezuela's vast oil reserves, which used to bring in hundreds of billions of dollars to Venezuela a year. But the bigger picture now raises even more questions. Is this just the beginning? Has the U.S. decided to take direct control over the entire Western Hemisphere? Does state sovereignty really mean anything anymore? And if the U.S. can take over any countries it sees fit, hello, Greenland, can Russia take over Ukraine? Can China take over Taiwan? If it's the law of the jungle, what's in store for the rest of 2026? Today we're talking with Ian Bremmer, president of the Eurasia Group, which focuses on global risk and just put out its annual study of the top risks facing the world. Welcome to the show, Ian. Listen, the third item in your top risk report is the Donro doctrine. For our audience, that is a modification of Donald Trump's name on a 200-year-old doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine, saying the United States controls everything in its hemisphere. You identified this as a major global risk well before the 3rd of January, well before Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped. Why did you see this coming, and what do you think it means in American engagement in the world?
Well, it's an application, Steve, of America First foreign policy to its backyard, which Trump considers a priority. That was written in the National Security Strategy document over a month ago, which I know you saw and read, and I did too. I don't think Trump read it, but it certainly reflects his orientation. We've also known for months that Trump has been not only escalating his military ultimatums and the ability to follow through on Nicolas Maduro, but also that he has been working military plans to be able to remove him, preferably to bring him back to justice in New York. That was something we heard about for the first time a couple of months ago. So we weren't at all surprised it happened. Certainly, the military operation was executed much more capably than I think a lot of people would have expected. And that itself proves a win for Trump. But the second order implications of this, beyond Maduro simply being removed, what it means for Venezuela and going forward, what it means for the rest of the Western Hemisphere, for the relations with Europe, as well as how the U.S. projects power all over the world. Clearly, these are transformational geopolitically, and it deserves to be at the top of our report.
So you've identified, you've said it in your report, that in a sense, the United States may very well be the greatest risk to a global order it created.
Yes, Stephen Miller is talking a lot, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and one of the architects of the Donro Doctrine and of the Venezuela intervention. And he's been saying it's always been about power. It's just about power. Yes, but it's about how you apply that power. So the United States has been the most powerful country in the world for a long time now. And after World War II, and until fairly recently, the application of that power was in support of a number of principles that the United States believed globally benefited it. So, for example, the promotion of a U.S.-led system of collective security that provided an umbrella that its allies would feel safe and secure under. The promotion of architecture of global free trade, reducing tariffs and allowing goods and services and people and capital to move faster and faster across borders. The promotion of a system of rule of law, the promotion of democracy internationally, not always consistently, frequently hypocritically, but nonetheless. Now, the United States remains today the most powerful country in the world. No one's disagreeing with Steve Miller or Donald Trump about that. But the application of that power is towards very, very different ends. It's much more unilateralist. It opposes collective security. It opposes free trade. It opposes rule of law. It opposes the promotion of democracy. And of course, that makes the United States far more unreliable for its allies. It makes the United States a much bigger driver of geopolitical risk on the global stage.
Well, listen to Donald Trump and his comments about whether this is nation building. Let's listen.
We're in the business of having countries around us that are viable and successful, and where the oil is allowed to freely come out because that's good. It gets the prices down. That's good for our country. Now, we have a very sick neighbor. It's not a neighbor, but it's close to a neighbor, and that's Venezuela. It's very sick. Colombia is very sick too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, and he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you.
Love to get your reaction to President Trump's defense of this action, saying it's not really nation building, that it's in the U.S. interest. Is this a flip-flop, or is there some consistency there?
It's certainly not regime change, because the same regime is in place. You remove the president, but everyone else, the vice president is now president. The head of security is still the head of security. All of the people that have been engaged in all the war crimes, with the exception of the president, they're still there, including many of whom have bounties on their heads from the United States. Now, having now removed the president and put him in prison, the United States is saying, we've proven that we can exert consequences. So if you don't behave the way we want, there are going to be further consequences. And, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Let's see how that works out. But it's not regime change. It's not nation building. Marco Rubio is not going to be a proconsul on the ground in Caracas. There's no Iraq Paul Bremmer equivalent. And the United States is not sending its men and women to go and fight and die on the shores of another country. And indeed, I do think, I mean, people have talked about, well, what if boots on the ground were required? I think that President Trump really resists that. I think if force were really required, if it really broke down, I suspect, and he hasn't spoken about this, but I suspect he'd be more interested in sending mercenaries and using the Venezuelan oil to pay for it. So it's not the taxpayers in the U.S., and it's not the Americans that are actually fighting and bleeding in other people's battles. And he has been consistent on that because, of course, so much of what the MAGA base opposes is this idea historically that the U.S. has engaged in these forever wars for blood and treasure benefiting shareholders and political leaders, but it's the unconnected and the poor that are fighting and dying in these battles. And that is something that, of course, Trump was able to use his political connections and wealth to avoid being drafted into Vietnam. And he understands why you wouldn't want to fight. And I think that that's something that he continues to support.
Isn't Donald Trump playing a smart hand? If that system is crumbling anyway from his perspective, with so many Americans who think somehow America fought the Cold War but China won, isn't by doing what he's doing, turning America into a mercantilist nation, more self-interested, unraveling the system of obligations that it has in the world, isn't that, in a sense, a smart play if that system was destined to come apart anyway?
Well, I would say that you are correct that the structure of the system was going to reach a geopolitical bust. It was in a cyclical down period, this G0 world, because the balance of power was increasingly misaligned with the principles, the values, the institutions, and the architecture that the world system was operating under. So in that regard, you are correct. But there are three ways to respond when you are in a G0, when you see the geopolitics, the wheels coming off of the system. The first is you can create institutions that better reflect the new balance of power. And the United States could take the lead in that, like the Chinese are doing with Belt and Road, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, like the UN and others have done with the COP summits on climate, like no one is doing on artificial intelligence, unfortunately. You can reform existing architecture. So the Russians invade Ukraine, the Nordics join NATO. The Europeans spend a lot more money. They recognize NATO's not fit for purpose. It needs to be a lot stronger, and the Europeans should be spending a lot more, and they actually decide they're going to do that. Or you can say, enough of this. I'm breaking that system. And sometimes you even go to war. Now, all three are plausible. the United States is basically saying it's undoing its own system. Trump is accelerating the move towards Jazeera. The reason I believe that is a mistake is because the United States is not a country that is politically well structured to succeed in the law of the jungle, right? I mean, if you want to be the most powerful with no rule of law, and it's just about who's able to exert power and get your will done, then, it's not just about how powerful your country is. It's critically about how powerful your leadership is. Now, Trump is running the most powerful country in the world, but Trump is not as powerful as Xi Jinping. He'd like to be, but he's not, because Xi Jinping is leader for life, because China has Xi Jinping thought. They have a little red book. They have the monopoly power of the Chinese Communist Party. They don't have term limits on running China. Trump is 80 years old. He's out in 2028. He's got an independent judiciary, a professional military, a federal system, 2 political parties. Like, he wants to be Xi Jinping, but he ain't Xi Jinping. And so, I mean, he can do all this stuff, and then the next president can come in and can undo it, just like Trump undid all the Biden stuff, and Biden did all the Trump stuff, and Trump undid all the Obama stuff. And of course, that means that long term, when the Americans throw out the institutional order, the U.S. will not be effective as the apex predator globally, no matter what you say to Maduro in the near term.
So the disunited United States is a constraint on Donald Trump.
Obviously, he would like it not to be, but he is inadequately disciplined to change that. You might have seen that Curtis Yarvin, who is this intellectual supporting the far right, wants America to become a monarchy, wants America to become a single party country, has been a big MAGA guy, has recently turned against Trump because he's angry that Trump isn't doing enough to create this revolution. And he's right, because, I mean, if Trump really wanted to make America first work globally, he wouldn't be faffing about in Greenland, and he wouldn't be talking so much about Venezuela. He'd be focusing all of his power and attention on destroying what he considers to be America's principal adversary, the Democratic Party in the U.S. And he just isn't that interested in doing that. He's not disciplined. He's impulsive. He cares about being in the headlines all the time and always having a new win. He's not the guy that's really going to be the revolutionary. Steve Bannon, who you know and I know, called him an imperfect vessel. He's much more than imperfect. He's not ultimately capable of carrying that water.
Well, you mentioned Greenland, and the moment I heard about bombs falling in Caracas, I said, wow, this could be an interesting pathway to further expansion in the Western Hemisphere. This is before President Trump or anyone had asked about Greenland, but it did come to mind. But let's hear what President Trump said about Greenland.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you. You know what Denmark did recently to boost up security in Greenland? They added one more dog sled. It's true. They thought that was a great move.
They added a dog sled. But, it raises this interesting question about something you just talked about, which is the unraveling. What is going to unravel? What's not going to unravel? Is NATO in America's interest? Not in America's interest. We know that at least half the week, President Trump has an allergy over NATO things. But if there was one step that would take it is some form of kinetic action that might take over Greenland, it would essentially, and many people believe, end NATO. What are your views?
Well, Trump has been saying that NATO is not effective, they're not paying their way, and they're paying a lot more now. And he was really angry that the Americans are spending all this money on Ukraine. And today, almost no taxpayer money is going to Ukraine. It's all coming from the Europeans. And I think Trump is surprised by that. And Trump can take some credit for it. But the reality is the Europeans matter more today in terms of the outcomes of Ukraine than they did before. They have gotten themselves a seat at the table and the ability to veto some of what Trump is trying to accomplish because they're actually have skin in the game, because they're spending the money. Now, on Greenland, Trump is correct that Denmark is not going to be capable of, projecting force to push back the Russians and the Chinese by themselves. But if it was so important, and Trump talked about buying Greenland in his first administration, why aren't the Americans putting more troops there? They have the ability to send more troops. They haven't done it. You used to have 10,000 troops on the ground in Greenland. I think it's 150 now. So, I mean, I know Trump thinks it's important now, but he was president for 4 years before. That does mean you're commander in chief. You could do something about it. And for all of the things, I mean, if Trump wants to have more bases, if he wants to have more listening posts, if he wants to, sort of ensure that the Russians and Chinese are not taking it over, he has the ability with a phone call to call one of America's closest and most steadfast allies, Denmark, and the Danish prime minister has made very clear they are prepared to negotiate whatever it is the Americans want. This is not about national security. This is about Trump wanting sovereignty over Greenland. He has decided that it is important that the territory of Greenland belongs to the United States in the same way that he wants his name on buildings or the Kennedy Center. And I hate to say this because it doesn't speak well of my president, but I think the reality is that this is about Trump's ego and his personal interests being put over those of the country, those of the United States. And there are other places that you can argue that, but this is perhaps the most clear on the geopolitical space, especially because it is undermining the strongest military alliance in the world, that between the United States and the Europeans, NATO.
But if you were Xi Jinping in China, you were Vladimir Putin in Russia, but I think it's more apt in China, seeing the changes that are going on and really this punctuation point about America's actions in the world, creating doubt in its own alliance structure. Why wouldn't you move tomorrow if you were China in taking over Taiwan? Why wouldn't you throw even more weight at taking over Ukraine or wiping out resistance in Ukraine right now, given what they're seeing from the U.S. president in the Western Hemisphere?
Well, that implies that the restraining factor on China and Russia has been America acting with some level of legitimacy and moral authority. And I do believe that America acting with legitimacy and moral authority has had an impact on the behavior of America's friends throughout history. But I don't think it's had much impact of the behavior of America's adversaries, countries the Americans consider to be bad actors. I mean, if you engage in war crimes, then, that kind of means that you're prepared to take the consequences of that. I was bemused that the Kremlin immediately, sort of was criticizing the breach of international law when the Americans took out Maduro. And of course, the argument is that Russia has so much experience breaching international law that they really know a breach when they see one. They are experts in the field. But the reason the Russians are not taking more of Ukraine is because they can't. I mean, if the Russians had 1/10 of the military capacity to execute on an operation that the Americans just displayed in Caracas, you and I, my friend Steve, would be having a very different conversation about Ukraine and the state of the transatlantic relationship today, because Ukraine would be Russian. Zelensky would be in prison or dead, right? That's the reality. The only thing stopping the Russians is their corruption, their kleptocracy, their lack of discipline, their lack of capacity, and the fact that they're getting so many of their young men killed and so many more of them are escaping. Now, in China, China's much more capable, and they're playing the long game. And what America's doing right now is much better for China's long-term interests, undermining America's alliances. But Taiwan is a highly fortified island. And the U.S. just supported the largest ever U.S. military defense sale to Taiwan. And there's critical semiconductor production there. The Chinese aren't taking Taiwan because it poses an unacceptable risk for the Chinese. I do think the Chinese will feel more emboldened to engage in more exercises around Taiwan, more leverage short of invasion to squeeze the Taiwanese, because Taiwan is very far away. And if the Donro doctrine applies to Venezuela and the Americans can bomb Venezuela while there is a high-level Chinese delegation there meeting with Maduro the night before, and they don't even tell the Chinese, then why should the Chinese tell the Americans about what they do in their backyard? But Taiwan is a capacity issue for China. It is not a legitimacy issue. One final point, Steve, and that is that China considers Taiwan to be a domestic issue, the equivalent of how the U.S. would act in Puerto Rico or in the District of Columbia. And so even though the Americans don't share that view, certainly that is not what is constraining Xi Jinping's behavior.
Let me ask you finally, you do get into AI a little bit, but in my show last week, I interviewed Victor Gao, who is vice president of the Center for China and Globalization. He said he worries about the evolution of AI, the power of AI, the increasing growing momentum there. And he saw one day where if they're not careful, both the United States as an entity and China as an entity would be subordinate to this super force of AI. I'm interested in it because you had some very interesting things to say about technology and AI as well as a significant risk factor.
Yeah, I think that the technology it's evolving in ways that are dangerous to society. I'm a big enthusiast about AI with contained data sets being deployed for inventions and efficiencies and productivity gains in industry, in biotech, in advanced energy technologies, in military and national defense technologies. All of those things I think are extraordinary, and they could lead us to create not only a lot of growth and wealth, but also really hit sustainable development goals for the poorest in the world. So I'm a big enthusiast. But when we talk about rolling AI out in individual uses, we're finding that human beings are programmable by AI much more quickly than AI is programmable and understandable to human beings. And I worry that the profit motivation with all this money that's being spent is leading these AI companies that are in the consumer sector to roll out and experiment with these algorithms that we think of as human beings. We interact with them. We don't even know they're not real people. And they increasingly have access to all the data that comprise us in the digital world. They know us better and more comprehensively than our families, our doctors, our lawyers, or anything. And that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. It's going to cause lots of misinformation, lots of political dysfunction and radicalism, and it's also going to rip apart the fabric of society because AI, right, only engages with us in the digital world, not in the real world, not physically, not emotionally or spiritually. It's just this digital programming interaction. And if the human beings increasingly spend all of their time engaging with and trusting that, and that's happening without regulatory authority or oversight, it's happening with a profit motive, but not with anyone that is ensuring that the people are going to be okay, then we're going to lose ourselves. And I think that is, I worry about that much more than I worry about the U.S. and China being subsumed. I worry about Ian and Steve and our kids getting subsumed, which I think should matter a lot more to us.
So, Ian, I want to congratulate you on helping us think big on what the big risks are out there. Thank you so much for joining us. Ian Bremmer, president of the risk analysis firm Eurasia Group, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Steve. See you in person soon.
So what's the bottom line? Much of the world looks at Venezuela as the case of a head of state who is kidnapped with total disregard for the country's sovereignty. Trump has been saying two things at the same time. One is that Maduro is a dope-dealing narco king, and his arrest is just an American law enforcement action. And the other is that Washington is going to, quote, run the country and take the oil. Now he's threatening at least 7 other nations with hostile takeovers. Some may argue that there never was a rule of law globally, and that it's always been a might makes right world, and that the international system has really always been an incoherent blob. All of this might work for the U.S. in the short term, but really, it may lead to a catastrophe down the road. Brace yourselves for a future where conflicts regularly erupt. Heading into this new year, the global risks of instability are very high, and in my view, getting worse. And that's the bottom line.